Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I do apologize if this introduction is a little rushed, but I want to get to the actual video due to the fact that this might be a little bit of a longer video. As you saw from the thumbnail and title, today we're talking about Lovecraft's racism. Now, out of the desire for complete transparency, there is something you should know. I am a Lovecraft fan. I'm a big fan of Lovecraft's writing, and on the screen right now are all of the books that I have about Lovecraft, of Lovecraft's writing, and books that concern the Cthulhu mythos as well as several others. However, even with that bias, my goal of this video is to approach the subject as analytically and objectively as possible. So please keep that in mind. Now, there are two more things that I want to state before we get into the video. The first is there is an amazing article written by Michael Billow that I highly recommend checking out. I will put a card either up there or down in the description so that way you can read it for yourself. It is a very well done article, and it's actually what inspired me to make this video. He goes into great detail about subjects that I merely touch upon within this video. So please do give that a look. And the final thing is, while creating the script for this video, it basically became an essay. I actually have 7 pages right here that are all typed and in essay format. Now, I do apologize if this video gets dry because of that, but I do feel like in order to address this subject in the most calculative and analytical way possible, the essay format is the best way to do so. So while I do read this essay, I will have a slideshow of pictures for you to watch so you do not get bored. Other than that, thank you guys very much for coming back, and on to the video. Now, before I begin, I do want to state that the issue that accompanies the discussion of Lovecraft's racism is that no matter which side of the fence you are on, there is always a good deal of speculation that goes into defending either side. I intend to do my best to limit the speculation, or at the very least, base my speculation upon facts that I state. While we do have actual manuscripts, collected letters, and published essays that clearly state Lovecraft's views, there is still a lot that is unknown about the actual formation of his ideals. The purpose of this video is not to excuse the deplorable ideas and beliefs that H.P. Lovecraft had about other races and cultures, but rather to view them through context in order to perhaps explain why he held these uninformed and misguided ideas. To reiterate, I wish not to condone these ideals nor condemn the man who held them. I believe that if one wishes to understand or attempt to understand Lovecraft, then one must be aware of what I believe to be his fundamental belief. Essentially, the underlying meaning and core of most, if not all, of his fiction writing. It is summed up in this quotation: "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Keep this in mind because I believe it to be crucial in understanding the mind of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Lovecraft spent a good deal of his childhood, as well as most of his life, in the small town of Providence, Rhode Island. His father was committed to an asylum due to mental illness and then died from syphilis while Lovecraft was still very young. This left his overbearing and unstable mother to raise him with help from his well-off grandfather, Whipple Phillips, whom they lived with. Almost all of Lovecraft's education and entertainment came from his grandfather's personal library, due to the fact that Lovecraft is reported to have suffered from many nervous abnormalities, which made attending school difficult, and his attendance was sparse. However, isolated in his grandfather's library, he was able to escape by reading literature from the 18th and early 19th century. I feel it is fair to assume that these books, along with the old-fashioned ideals of the time and place when Lovecraft lived, instilled in him a type of superiority complex, which placed his culture and race above all others. Along with this complex, there is also paired the separation he felt from others due to his isolation, which created a unique relationship with the dynamics of him versus the outside or other, whichever you prefer. The Lovecraft side comprising of what was known and comfortable to him. This, of course, meaning his grandfather's library of books and his small, peaceful town which honored the customs, culture, and history that he so adored, while the outside portion of this dynamic represents exactly that. It is all that remained beyond the boundaries of the fabricated tranquility that Lovecraft perceived to know. The outside does not only represent other places beyond Providence, but other people of different ethnic backgrounds, cultures, and skin tone. I mention this relationship because it correlates so well with Lovecraft's core belief, which is the strength of fear, and more importantly, the fear of what is unknown to us. Lovecraft not only wrote about such fears, but experienced them firsthand. For a shy, secluded, nerve-ridden boy maturing into adolescence, who was familiar only with his own culture, the thought or observation of other cultures or ethnicities flowing into the United States was surely a frightening and daunting experience to him, which bred intimidation, frustration, contempt, paranoia, and fear. Lovecraft's health remained an ever-present problem, and by the age of 18, Lovecraft reported to have suffered a major mental breakdown that was so severe that the reports state that he endured tics, seizures, and light sensitivity, which could be characterized as a result of a possible childhood head injury. Due to this, Lovecraft isolated himself almost entirely from the outside world from the years 1908 to 1913. During this time, not much is known other than it being troublesome for Lovecraft. I wager that this dark period of near complete isolation and poor health furthered the intimidation and paranoia that had already developed from his early years. This dark period of Lovecraft's life did eventually cease, and he then took up the hobby of amateur journalism. He published his own journal called The Conservative. In this journal, Lovecraft states many of his xenophobic and anti-Semitic beliefs. This journal was active from 1915 to 1923, which happens to be the same year he was married to Sonia Green. Lovecraft met Sonia Green in 1921 and became close, and would later fall in love over their shared joy for writing and journalism. His relationship with Sonia was Lovecraft's first intimate relationship, and she would be the only romantic companion he would have within his lifetime. What makes Lovecraft's marriage to Sonia so interesting is that Sonia was not only a Jew, but also a Ukrainian immigrant. This information is even more stunning when you take into account that Lovecraft had such negative opinions of both immigrants and the Jewish, which he stated earlier in his life. One may argue that this was a sign of a long and arduous process of developing a tolerance or acceptance towards differing cultures and ethnicities. However, even if that point is argued, what is to follow could also be argued against Lovecraft's favor. Once married, Sonia encouraged Lovecraft to move to New York City, with her hoping that it would be better for his writing career. He agreed, but found the entire experience to be unbearable. During his time in Brooklyn, due to the massive influx of immigrants and filth of the booming metropolis, Lovecraft's paranoia, xenophobia, and depression worsened greatly. This was not helped when their home was burglarized and many of their cherished belongings were stolen. This unhappiness led Lovecraft to write The Horror at Red Hook, the story that is claimed by all who are critical of Lovecraft to be the crowning example of his xenophobic ideals bleeding into his fiction. I intend to address this story in the following segments, but first I would like to include a few more outside factors that at the time may have contributed and explained Lovecraft's thought process. For those of you who are unaware, eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population. Historically, by excluding people and groups judged to be inferior and promoting those judged as superior. The contemporary history of eugenics began in the early 20th century when a popular eugenics movement emerged in the United Kingdom and then spread to many countries, including the United States, Canada, and most European countries. In this period, people from across the political spectrum adopted and supported eugenic ideas. Many countries even adopted eugenic policies intended to improve the quality of their population's genetic stock. Such programs included both positive measures, such as encouraging individuals deemed fit to produce, and negative measures such as prohibiting marriages and forced sterilization of people deemed unfit for reproduction. Those deemed unfit to reproduce often included people with mental or physical disabilities, people who had low IQ scores, criminals, and members of unfavored minority groups. Eugenics was a widely accepted science in Lovecraft's day, and while we know today that there is nothing scientific about it, many people, along with Lovecraft, placed their beliefs in it. So, with somebody who already held the toxic ideal of his own race and culture being superior to others, this so-called science encouraged and supported that misguided idea. In 1915, the film The Birth of a Nation was released and portrayed an incredibly racist and inaccurate picture of African Americans. It also portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as a noble organization that should be hailed as heroes. This led to the rejuvenation of the KKK, and by 1920, the organization had upwards of 4 million members. This equates to about 15% of the eligible population in the United States at the time. All of this happened throughout Lovecraft's lifetime. While this does not at all excuse Lovecraft's words and ideals, I think it does shed light on the fact that he was far from the only one at the time to have such ideas. Furthermore, I would also claim that Lovecraft's xenophobia not only stemmed from ignorance of ethnicities and fear of different cultures, but mostly out of the fear of his own beloved culture being disintegrated into nothingness. Whereas the ideals and, more importantly, actions of the KKK stemmed from hatred, which led to terrible and detestable acts of violence. Lovecraft, even with his ignorance, never harmed another being. For as long as I have read Lovecraft's work, I have never thought of his work as racist. In fact, I never knew to what extent his xenophobia was, because it is almost entirely contained in his personal letters and selected essays, which I have read only few of the latter and none of the former. As I mentioned previously, the example that is consistently brought up is the descriptions of the inhabitants of Red Hook, who happen to be Syrian, Italian, Spanish, and black immigrants. While these descriptions are less than favorable, I had always interpreted them to belong to the detective who is the main character of the story. I don't believe it is so highly illogical to think that a seasoned, grizzled New York detective in the 20s might have jaded, unfavorable opinions of a decrepit, crime-ridden area. I have always and continue to believe that the characters in Lovecraft's stories are not as important as the events that they bear witness to. This is primarily the case because Lovecraft's stories contain such a definite element of anti-humanism. Lovecraft treats humans in his stories with the same disregard as humans treat an ant on the sidewalk. Compared to the elder gods, the old ones, we are the microscopically unimportant ants. There are accounts that by 1931, Lovecraft openly admitted that the scientific consensus stated that there was no intrinsic biological difference between race and ethnicities. This appears to be a drastic departure from the ideals he thought to be true in his youth. One can also claim that Lovecraft's marriage to the Jewish-Ukrainian immigrant Sonia, as well as being lifelong friends with the Jewish poet Samuel Loveman, show that Lovecraft's hateful statements were hollow and meaningless. On the same token, one can merely look through his mountain of correspondence and find a multitude of venomously racist comments that could enrage even the most mild-mannered reader. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, speculation and theorizing always occur in this discussion and ultimately become the end result of the argument. Many theorize that if Lovecraft had lived longer, not only would he have produced greater works of fiction, but also would have changed his mind completely on the ideas of race and culture. Others speculate that with the U.S. allowing more and more immigrants into the country, Lovecraft's xenophobia would have reached even greater heights. Ultimately, it is up to you to decide. I cannot decide for you. Personally, I believe that very little of his personal prejudices seep into his fiction. And in the rare case that it does, they are far from the focal point of the story. As I said, Lovecraft's characters are not even remotely as important as the journey they go on or the terror that appears in their lives. The cosmic, monstrous mysteries that can't be conceived even in the most horrible of nightmares or found in the darkest of night skies is what Lovecraft's fiction is and always will be. I realize that he is a man with a great deal of flaws and imperfections. Thus, why I admire the fiction of Lovecraft, not necessarily the man himself, whose xenophobic ideals and beliefs I find to be both misguided and deplorable.